Hi everybody, this is a big experiment for me. We're going to try to do this on video and um, hopefully it will go well and it'll be just like you're in class. So the topic for today's lecture is parasites and zoonoses. And if you think about the whole universe of interactions between different kinds of animals or different kinds of living organisms, you're talking about the world of symbiosis, how different organisms live together. And depending on whether those interactions between organisms are beneficial or whether they have costs to one member of the pair, to both members of the pair, then you can label those in different ways. So you have situations of mutualism or cooperation where both individuals that are interacting benefit from the interaction. So that's the plus. You also have the spite situation, at least in theory, where both interacting individuals pay a cost to their interaction. And then you have a variety of different kinds of interactions where one of the individuals benefits and the other pays a cost. And so this could be called predation. That's usually when one individual kills and consumes the other. And there's also parasitism that occurs when two individuals have an interaction and one of them benefits, one pays a cost, but it usually isn't a lethal cost. So we're going to focus on this concept of parasitism and how it relates to mammals, and especially how it relates to mammals in the sense that in many cases the parasites can infect humans as well. So that's where zoonoses come in. Zoonoses are diseases that are carried by other animals and also can infect humans. So if we look at parasites, we can classify them in a whole bunch of different ways. So the first is based on the size of the parasite. So you have microparasites, which are basically things that are too small for us to see with our naked eye, and macroparasites, which are bigger things. So let's take a look at a few examples of those. So microparasites could be viruses, that's the HIV virus, or bacteria. This is the bacterium that causes Lyme disease. And then if we look at macroparasites, one example of this is the tapeworm. So this is what these guys look like. They're flattened worms that have body segments that can fall off. And nematodes, another kind of worm. And then also arthropods, things like insects and spiders. And oops, I forgot to update that. I'll show you a different picture. Here's an arthropod, which is the deer tick that can infect all kinds of mammals. All right, so we can also classify them as obligate or facultative. So obligate parasites are ones that absolutely have to either feed on another animal or have a dependency on another species to complete their life cycle. So they can't live, they can't reproduce without having an interaction with another individual of a different species. Facultative parasites are those that can have parasitic relationships with other organisms, but it's not necessary for them to complete their life cycle or to reproduce. They can live on their own if they have to, but they can also be parasitic if they have the opportunity to be parasitic. Then we can also classify them based on whether you find them inside the body or outside the body. So endoparasites are the ones that are found inside, so in the bloodstream or in the muscle tissue or in the digestive tract. Ectoparasites, on the other hand, are things that you would find on the outer surface of an animal. So things like fleas and ticks and lice would all be ectoparasites that are found on the outside. So if we look at some general characteristics of parasites, usually they're smaller than the host, because if they were larger than the host, they would probably kill the host, so that's not how these relationships usually work. They're usually physiologically dependent on the host. If they're obligate parasites, they are absolutely physiologically dependent on the host. Very often they are specific to a particular host, so they complete their life cycle in some specific species and not in other species that may be found in the same environment. There are parasites, though, that are more generalist, that could parasitize many different species, so that varies from parasite to parasite. Usually they don't kill the host, but they may debilitate it. So the host may be weaker because of the cost it's paying to helping um, benefit the parasitic species. It's very, very common for the parasite to have a complex life cycle. So that means that it may have parts of its life cycle where it is dependent on the host and other parts of the life cycle where it's not dependent on the host, where it may have multiple host species that moves from one to the other at different parts of its life. So I'm going to show you a couple of life cycles just so you get the flavor for how this works. So here's one example. It's the deer tick. So this is the animal that carries Lyme disease between other mammals and humans. And if you look at the life of a deer tick, it feeds off of 3 different hosts. So the first host is usually a small mammal species or a bird species. So you see some pictures of various examples of the primary host for the first life stage. Then it has another life stage where it again feeds on one of a number of different warm-blooded species, either a mammal or a bird. It undergoes metamorphosis again, becomes an adult, and if it's a female, it gets one more meal of blood before it's ready to lay its eggs, and usually at that point it's going to attach itself to a deer. But it could feed from many species throughout its life cycle. If we look at the life cycle of a tapeworm, it's also pretty interesting. So I love this one because it has the picture of the girl eating the hamburger. It really gives you a good appetite here. This is what the tapeworm looks like as an adult, and it has various segments, and the segments are hollow, and there are eggs that are within these, or eggs or cysts that are within these segments. So the cysts come out and would be found in the grass here. They're eaten up by whatever herbivore is eating that grass. So in this case, it's a cow. They make their way at a different part of their life cycle to the muscle tissue. And if you eat undercooked beef, you are eating these little cyst things that grow to be a tapeworm. And the tapeworm would be in the person's digestive tract. It would live inside the digestive tract, parasitizing the food that the person eats. So that's where it gets its nutrients, by just taking whatever you're eating. And then parts of it will break off and go out with the feces. So when the feces hit the ground, obviously if it's a human, it may not end up in the ground, but if it's eaten by another animal that is a wild animal and defecates on the ground, then it starts its life cycle all over again. So here's a picture of a tapeworm, pretty weird looking animal. These hooks are used to anchor the end of the tapeworm inside the digestive tract. So that's how it keeps from going out with the feces. It hooks itself in, and then as the food comes by, it grabs what it needs to nourish itself. The third example is something called a meningeal worm. This isn't something that infects humans, but it infects a lot of ungulate species. And it's found in white-tailed deer in North America, and it also has a very complex life cycle. So it lives part of its life cycle in deer, but it also, at some point in its life cycle, gets defecated out onto the ground. It makes its way into snails and slugs, and then the snails and slugs are usually accidentally ingested by the herbivore because they're crawling around on the ground and they're in the vegetation, and so they're just eaten up as a byproduct of that herbivore eating the grass. All right, so zoonotic diseases are those diseases that are carried by non-human animals, but they can be carried to humans. And we're going to look at one case study of a zoonotic disease, which is Lyme disease, which can be transmitted to humans. And then we'll look at a second case study that is not a zoonotic disease, but is something that is a problem for conservation biologists. All right, so Lyme disease is caused by a bacterium, and the bacterium is called Borrelia burgdorferi, and it's a spirochete, so it's, oops, come on, go. So it's one of those corkscrew-shaped bacteria. This is a picture of what it looks like. And it actually gets carried from mammal species to humans by an arachnid, by the deer tick. So here's what the deer tick looks like. They're very, very tiny, especially in their early life stages. So it's got 3 different life stages after it hatches from an egg. First, it's a larva, which is really tiny. Then it metamorphoses into a nymph, which is also teeny tiny. Here's a dime for size comparison. And then after another blood meal, it metamorphoses into an adult, and males and females are different in size. For males, this is kind of the end of the road. They don't take any more blood meals. Females are slightly bigger than males. They're going to take 1 more blood meal to get enough energy to lay eggs. So if you were to be bitten by an arachnid that was infected with this bacterium, you might have some symptoms. And one of the most well-known symptoms is this bullseye rash. It happens about 90% of the time, but a lot of times it's not noticed because you know what ticks do when they get on you. They go, in your hair. So if you were to be bitten on the scalp or other places where you couldn't see, you would never notice that you had a bullseye rash. So it's very possible that you might become infected without ever knowing about it. A lot of the early symptoms of Lyme disease are pretty nondescript. So low-grade fever, muscle aches, lethargy. You could be sick with anything and have those symptoms. So it doesn't really point to anything really specific. The problem comes that if you don't catch your infection early on, then it progresses to much more serious symptoms. So cardiac problems, arthritis, neurological symptoms. If it's caught early on, you get put on antibiotics, it clears it up pretty quickly. The longer it goes, the more difficult it is to cure the disease, and the bigger the risk is that the symptoms will not go away. So some of this damage may be permanent if it's not caught early. So part of our approach to keeping humans from getting this disease is to learn a lot about how the disease progresses and what the species are that are involved in the life cycle so that we can interrupt it. All right, so we're going to look at another picture of how the life cycle progresses. So you have eggs, they hatch into larvae. The larvae need a blood meal to be able to metamorphose into a larger version. So they're going to go after some small animal, a bird or a mammal, and they will feed off of a variety of different species. Some of these mammals carry the bacterium that causes Lyme disease, and some don't. So depending on who they feed off of, they may get infected at this stage or not. They're never infected when they hatch out, so the disease does not pass from the female to the eggs, from the female tick to the eggs. So the larvae may pick up Lyme disease here. It will metamorphose into a nymph, and through the fall and the winter, there's not much going on when the weather is cold. But at some point, the nymph is going to get active again when spring rolls around, and it's going to look for a blood meal so it can metamorphose into an adult. And at this point, it's going to look for usually a bigger mammal, and often that's going to be a human being if a human being wanders through the area where the nymph is hanging out. But it could also be a dog or a mouse or something. If the larval deer tick did not get infected in its first blood meal, it's possible that the nymph will get infected here. But if the nymph was infected and it bites a human, it's going to give the human the disease. Then after that blood meal, it's going to drop off and it's going to metamorphose into an adult, and it's going to, if it's a female, take 1 more blood meal, and that may also be a human or a large mammal that's close by. A large mammal is preferred at this life stage. Small mammals are preferred at the earlier life stages. And here they lay eggs after that last blood meal. So this outline basically just takes you through those steps and shows you some of the pictures. The primary host for the disease, it turns out, is a mouse called the white-footed mouse, which is extremely common through a large part of the eastern United States. And there are other species that also can